I stared at the email on my laptop, blinking like it might rewrite itself. The subject line alone made my chest tighten. Asterisk, account access denied. Funds locked by owner. Asterisk, if you're watching this, subscribe and comment where you're watching from. I rubbed my temples and leaned back in the cracked leather chair of my home office in central Austin, Texas. Outside, a late summer sun glared off the neighbors' metal roofs, and the AC hummed in protest against the heat. A stack of overdue property tax bills teetered on the desk next to my laptop, mocking me silently. My son, Ethan, had just fired off a text, sharp as a whip. Asterisk, you can't touch my money, Dad. That's final. Asterisk. I froze. Final, he said, like I was a child trying to sneak cookies from the jar. Only, this wasn't cookies. It was the brokerage account holding the inheritance I'd managed for years. The same one he thought he fully controlled. I closed my eyes. My pulse thumped in my ears as I remembered the letter from the bank, stamped and mailed weeks ago. Everything was still legally in my name. Legally. Not just morally or practically, but backed by paperwork that could make a grown man pause. The irony. I'd always been the type to avoid confrontation, believing peace was safer than insisting on boundaries. Yet here I was, cornered by my own son. I scrolled through the account history again. Every withdrawal he'd made in the past month, the pricey electronics, the impulsive trip bookings, the investment opportunities that barely existed, were all technically under my name. Technically. And that's when I realized the moment had arrived. The moment I could stop pretending. Stop letting fear of conflict let him run wild. I set my coffee mug down, a Starbucks from 2 blocks over, still warm, and picked up my phone. I started drafting a certified notice, just like the property lawyer I'd consulted suggested. It had to be airtight, undeniable, and completely legal. Then Ethan called. Dad, seriously, back off. That money's mine. I paused. The calm in my chest had a strange weight to it. I smiled faintly, like a chess player watching the pawn think it's winning. Not exactly, son. Not exactly. If that sounds harsh, here's how we got there. I sank deeper into the chair, letting the hum of the AC fill the silence. The house smelled faintly of cedar from the bookshelves lining the living room, mingling with the coffee I'd just poured. Sunlight cut across the hardwood floor in sharp stripes, warming the room as if to remind me the day would not wait. I closed my eyes and let my mind wander, replaying the months leading up to this confrontation. For years, I believed that avoiding conflict kept the peace, that keeping the books, paying the taxes, and quietly handling family finances would protect everyone from tension. But Ethan's words, so casual, so absolute, proved that my approach had been flawed. Boundaries left unspoken invite overreach. I felt a twinge of guilt mixed with irritation. I had wanted to trust him, to let him grow into responsibility. Instead, I'd let him assume control over what was legally mine. I thought about the little signs I'd missed, the Amazon boxes stacked in the corner of his apartment when he said he was saving money, the mysterious withdrawals from the joint investment account, the credit card statements he forgot to shred, showing charges I didn't authorize. Each one seemed minor in isolation, easy to dismiss. But now, together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent decades auditing spreadsheets, ensuring every decimal aligned perfectly. Yet I hadn't audited the human behavior in my own home. I chuckled softly at myself. How ironic that the thing I understood best, numbers, now offered a roadmap for reclaiming what was mine. The tension in my shoulders eased slightly as I considered the legal leverage at my fingertips. Property records, certified notices, bank forms, all tools to assert boundaries clearly and professionally. Not revenge in the petty sense, but accountability. A way to correct the imbalance without crossing the line. That calm, methodical approach felt reassuring, almost comforting. I let my mind wander to my childhood in Dallas, Texas, where my own father taught me discipline and foresight. He'd always said, David, control what you can. Let go of what you can't, but never let someone redefine what's yours. Those words had stayed tucked in the corner of my mind, largely ignored in favor of keeping the peace. Now, they resonated louder than ever. Even the everyday details of my life in Austin, seemed to echo my inner reckoning. The grocery store aisles where I'd spend hours calculating coupons, the coffee drive-thru where baristas knew my regular order, the freeway I took to the bank every Thursday morning. All familiar routines now felt like stages for an impending pivot. Every mundane chore reminded me that the ordinary can be the setting for extraordinary change. And then there was the physical sensation of readiness, my hands tightening around the pen, the slight ache in my lower back from leaning over the desk too long, the flutter in my stomach that was equal parts anxiety and anticipation. All of it reminded me I was alive, alert, and capable of action. If the sense of calm was brief, it was intentional. I needed to reflect, to see the situation clearly before moving. The misbelief that avoiding conflict equaled safety had cost me dearly, but it also offered clarity. Foresight, boundaries, and lawful strategy would be my allies. I stood, stretching the tension out of my spine. By the time I returned to the laptop, the path forward felt sharper, more defined. It was no longer about simply reclaiming money. It was about teaching responsibility, respect, and accountability in a way that wouldn't compromise my values. But the truth didn't start that day. It started months earlier, with small oversights, quiet assumptions, and the first sparks of entitlement that Ethan had never been called out on. Months earlier, life had felt deceptively ordinary. I'd spent mornings at my Austin condo, sipping coffee in the kitchen, scanning the stock market updates, while the dog, a golden retriever named Rusty, curled at my feet. I'd check emails from the bank, review investment reports, and shuffle through the stacks of property tax notices. Everything seemed routine, manageable, safe. Then came Ethan's first big request. He wanted access to the inheritance to cover an expensive photography course in New York. He painted it as a stepping stone to success, networking opportunities, gallery connections, travel, and living expenses. I agreed, thinking I was empowering him, not realizing I was opening a door to a pattern of entitlement. I signed a temporary authorization form for the account, thinking it was a controlled measure. Little did I know it would set the tone for months of overreach. Our relationship had always been cordial but distant. Ethan was 34, independent in many ways, and full of confidence, sometimes too much. He had the charm to win over clients at his marketing agency, but I had learned early that charm without accountability was dangerous. I tolerated small financial missteps in college, thinking it was part of growing up. But hindsight was a cruel teacher. The first red flag came 3 weeks later. I logged into the account for a routine review and found a nearly $5,000 withdrawal for a photography studio rental he hadn't mentioned. My heart sank, but I convinced myself it was a necessary expense. After all, he was pursuing his career. But then 2 days later, Amazon charges appeared $1, 200 in camera equipment accessories, lighting gear, again, unapproved. I made a mental note, but let it slide, believing my peacekeeping approach was still valid. One evening, I caught another glimpse of the escalating pattern. Ethan had invited friends over for what he called a creative workshop, but the receipts I stumbled upon later showed a catered dinner and Uber rides, totaling nearly $800. I sat in my home office, Rusty at my feet, and realized that the money was disappearing faster than I had imagined. My instinct to intervene clashed with my long-held misbelief. Confrontation breeds conflict. Around the same time, property taxes and utility bills began piling up. I had taken care to allocate funds from my own retirement and savings to cover the condo and investment properties. One misfiled form at the bank, though, delayed a tax payment, and I felt the stress immediately. The risk was no longer abstract. It was tangible. Each oversight from Ethan now had real consequences. To compound matters, a lease clause on the downtown rental property I owned required certain repairs to be completed by June. Ethan had promised to handle vendor scheduling, but neglected to confirm the appointments. I had to call electricians, plumbers, and HVAC technicians at my own expense, feeling a growing sense of frustration. The documents, the lease clause, receipts, and emails became artifacts of a pattern I could not ignore. I remember one specific scene, a Saturday morning at the neighborhood diner, the one with the faded best pancakes in Austin sign. I sat with my friend and former colleague, Mark, sharing coffee, and recounting the mounting series of small betrayals. Mark, ever the realist, reminded me, "David, the peace you're buying comes at your expense. Sometimes the ledger doesn't balance if you're not enforcing the rules." His words lingered in my mind. A few weeks later, another clue presented itself. A bank notification flagged Ethan's credit card usage exceeding $7,500 in a single month. He claimed these were investments for his freelance marketing clients, but emails I intercepted suggested personal indulgences, concert tickets, high-end electronics, and a weekend trip to Santa Fe. Each discovery chipped away at my patience, but I still hesitated. Conflict, after all, had always felt dangerous. Then came the final seed. A misdelivered letter from the bank indicating that all assets were technically still under my name. It sat unopened in my mailbox for 2 days. I remember holding it, turning it over in my hands, the sunlight streaming through the blinds onto the envelope. That moment crystallized everything. I had the legal leverage to assert control, to teach accountability, and to correct the trajectory of this entitlement before it became permanent. Which brings us to the plan I should have made sooner. The realization was simple but profound. Documentation, legal boundaries, and well-timed action were the keys. The next step was to transition from reflection to strategy, from observing the pattern to enforcing it, from hope to action. I sat at my kitchen table that evening, sunlight fading into the soft orange of a Texas sunset, Rusty resting his head on my knee. The stack of documents in front of me felt heavier than any ledger I'd balanced in decades. Bank forms, property records, certified mail envelopes, even screenshots of Ethan's spending history. I had everything I needed to build a plan. The first step was clarity. I didn't want to ambush him emotionally or humiliate him. This wasn't about petty revenge. It was about boundaries and legal accountability. If I acted methodically, I could assert control without crossing ethical lines. I drafted the certified notice first. It stated plainly that the account in question remained legally under my name, that unauthorized withdrawals would not be tolerated, and that all future transfers required written consent from me. I reviewed it twice, even triple-checked with Mark, my retired colleague, who knew the ropes of financial regulations. Every word mattered. Next, I set a timer. The upcoming quarterly property tax deadline in 6 weeks. That date became the linchpin of my strategy. If Ethan ignored my notice or tried to manipulate the timing, I could escalate via a formal filing without bending the law. Deadlines have a way of focusing the mind, and this one would focus his. I also reached out to a local small claims consultant. The conversation was brief but invaluable. "David," she said, "the law is your tool, not your weapon. Keep everything documented, every step traceable, and you'll never have to justify more than what's factual." That advice settled the nervous flutter in my chest. I wasn't acting in anger. I was acting in foresight. Stakes were high. Beyond the account, Ethan's mismanagement threatened our reputation in the neighborhood and his own credit standing. If I acted now, I could prevent long-term damage and send a clear message about responsibility. Then the pushback started. Not from Ethan yet. He would come, but from the small details I had to manage. A misfiled bank form delayed verification. A utility bill deadline crept forward faster than expected. Even Rusty's vet appointment collided with a notarization schedule. Each hiccup forced me to adjust my timing, making the plan feel like a chess match against unseen pieces. I also had allies. Mark, of course, who offered advice and moral support, and my neighbor, Clara, who had once navigated a complicated property dispute herself. Both understood the importance of lawful, measured action and agreed to witness certain steps if necessary. Having their backing made the prospect of confrontation less intimidating. Finally, I considered the wild card, the local bank officer who could confirm account ownership in writing. Their cooperation wasn't guaranteed, but securing a neutral authority statement would strengthen the legal weight of my actions. It became clear. If everything lined up, the certified notice, the deadline, the witnesses, and the bank confirmation, I could confront Ethan with facts he couldn't argue against. By the time the sun fully set, painting the Austin skyline in purples and pinks, the outline of my plan was complete. It was clean, legal, and deliberate. The next steps were straightforward. Issue the notice, verify receipt, confirm all documentation with the bank, and prepare to escalate through formal channels if Ethan ignored the boundaries. I felt a rare sense of anticipation, not excitement, but a quiet confidence. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about asserting what was rightfully mine, while teaching a lesson in accountability. Ethan's entitlement had gone unchecked for too long. It was time to draw the line in plain ink. Then I glanced at the clock. The week before the tax deadline had begun. 6 weeks to execute flawlessly. 6 weeks to ensure that every action was documented, every response measured. Every misstep from Ethan would be met with a lawful consequence, which meant the only move left was to watch, prepare, and wait for him to reveal his next hand. The first complication arrived faster than I expected. 2 days after sending the certified notice, the bank called. There had been a misfiled form, some minor administrative error, but it delayed confirmation of the account's ownership. I spent a full afternoon on hold, shuffling papers, repeating my name, address, and account numbers over and over. By the time I hung up, my patience was frayed, but the record was now officially flagged as legally under my name. Ethan, of course, had reacted immediately. His calls were sharp, demanding, and full of bravado. "Dad, seriously, back off. That account is mine. You can't do this." I remained calm, letting the voicemail sit untouched. Each call he made, each text he sent, became evidence of his misunderstanding and entitlement. Then came a surprise twist from the HOA for the condo I owned downtown. Apparently, a routine inspection uncovered a minor code violation, a loose railing near the balcony. They sent a formal warning demanding repairs within 10 days. On the surface, it had nothing to do with Ethan, but I realized that any delay in payments from mismanaged funds could lead to fines. Stakes were rising, and I had to keep every deadline aligned. To complicate matters, Mark had a minor health scare, forcing him to step back temporarily. I had counted on his support as a witness for document handoffs and verification. With him unavailable, I needed to find an alternative. My neighbor Clara agreed to be present for notarizations, but she had her own schedule constraints. Every adjustment felt like a minor domino, threatening to topple the whole plan. Amid these complications, a mini reveal appeared. An old email thread from Ethan surfaced in my inbox, showing that he had secretly taken a personal loan to cover some of his indulgences. That discovery reframed my understanding. His demand for access wasn't just entitlement. It was desperation to cover debts I hadn't known about. For a moment, I felt the familiar tug of empathy, but I reminded myself, accountability was still necessary. Compassion didn't mean giving control away. Social pressures started creeping in too. A few neighbors had seen Ethan spending freely, posting photos on social media, and rumors began circulating about his lifestyle. While mostly harmless, it added subtle pressure on me. I didn't want to appear overbearing or petty in the community, which meant every action had to be legally justified and impeccably documented. The mini-crises continued stacking. Rusty's vet visit required an early morning drive across town, overlapping with a scheduled notarization appointment. One of the electricians I needed for the condo railing called to reschedule for a week later. Every misalignment in timing required careful juggling. Yet, paradoxically, these obstacles reinforced the importance of structure. Each delay, each hiccup, highlighted the stakes and reminded me why a measured, lawful approach was the only way forward. By the 3rd week, Ethan's response escalated. He enlisted a lawyer, sending a sharply worded letter demanding access and threatening to challenge the account ownership. I read it carefully, underlining phrases, noting contradictions, and filing the entire exchange. It was an overconfident move on his part. He hadn't accounted for the proper paperwork I already had in place. At the same time, I started noticing small personal costs. My evenings were now occupied with calls, document prep, and scheduling. Sleep became shorter. My mind constantly circled contingencies. Even with all my planning, the emotional toll was real. Yet I reminded myself, stakes were higher than comfort. This was about principle, not convenience. Then, the final complication of this phase emerged. A misplaced bank statement showing a $2,000 withdrawal I hadn't anticipated. My heart sank, but I quickly traced it back to a pending vendor payment I had authorized. Relief washed over me. but the scare highlighted how easily missteps could derail my plan. I adjusted my ledger, double-checking every future transaction and reinforcing my process. That's when I realized I'd been looking at the wrong problem. The challenge wasn't Ethan's attitude, nor even the misfiled forms or HOA notices. The real issue was timing, clarity, and unwavering documentation. Every obstacle, delay, or social pressure became a test of my system. If I could maintain precision and patience, I could turn this cascade of complications into a structured, controlled outcome. The morning light spilled through the blinds, painting stripes across my desk, as if the universe itself were marking the hours. I leaned back in my chair, rusty at my feet, and let out a long, measured sigh. That's when it hit me. I'd been focusing too much on stopping Ethan. That was the wrong goal. The real objective wasn't control. It was accountability. Up until now, my actions had been reactive. Certified notices, deadline tracking, bank confirmations. Each step was about correcting his overreach. But I realized that the ultimate measure of success would be whether he learned the boundaries. I needed to reframe the plan ethically, shifting from blocking to clarifying responsibility. I drafted a new strategy. First, I would hold a formal meeting in person. Not a confrontation, but a sit down with the facts clearly laid out. Property records, bank statements, overdue notices, and receipts, all presented in an organized binder. It was a public stance, a declaration that the account was legally mine and that any future misuse would have consequences. Transparency would serve as both shield and lesson. Next, I considered the timing. The HOA inspection and property tax deadlines were still looming, but by sequencing my actions, meeting first, then filing any necessary formal claims, I could maintain clarity and leverage. Deadlines were no longer just pressure points. They became tools to ensure structure and fairness. I also formalized my witnesses. Claire agreed to attend the meeting as a neutral observer. Her presence would ensure that no one could dispute the facts later, and it added credibility. Documentation, witness testimony, and transparency. These would form a triad of accountability. Then came the ethical pivot. I decided that any legal escalation, small claims, liens, or formal complaints, would be clearly communicated as a measure of last resort. The message to Ethan had to be, I am not trying to punish you. I am enforcing boundaries and protecting shared responsibility. I wanted him to see that law and fairness, not anger, governed my actions. I rehearsed the conversation mentally, imagining his defiance, his smugness, his quick defenses. But instead of reacting emotionally, I pictured staying calm, pointing to the ledger, showing the facts, and calmly explaining each consequence. Each detail tied back to prior documents. The misfiled bank form, the HOA notice, the overdue tax bills. Everything had a reason, a trail, a lawful foundation. That public stance moment came sooner than expected. On a Tuesday afternoon, I invited Ethan to the kitchen table, Rusty curled at my feet. I laid out the binder, organized by date, with each transaction, form, and email carefully cataloged. Clara sat quietly beside me, her pen ready to notarize acknowledgments if needed. I took a deep breath. Ethan, these assets are legally mine, not to control you, but to ensure accountability. Unauthorized use has consequences. Let's go through this together. My voice was steady, firm, calm. No anger, no accusation. Just facts. The shift was subtle but profound. Ethan paused, scanning the documents, eyes widening as he realized the weight of the evidence. For the first time, I saw him truly absorb the reality, not just argue instinctively. The pivot had worked. Public accountability, lawful clarity, and ethical framing turned a reactive plan into a proactive lesson. So I stopped asking for permission and started following the rules, every single one. Certified notices were mailed, deadlines confirmed, witnesses present, and bank confirmation secured. I wasn't bluffing anymore. I was fully prepared to enforce consequences, legally and ethically. And in that moment, leaning back, feeling the late morning sun warm my shoulders, I understood. This wasn't just about the money. It was about responsibility, foresight, and the courage to enforce boundaries. That was the real midpoint shift, seeing the battle not as one of control, but of structured accountability. The following week, I moved into full execution mode. Every step had to be documented, verifiable, and legally airtight. First, I revisited the certified notice I drafted, double-checking dates, account numbers, and legal references. I mailed it via certified mail, returned receipt requested, ensuring the post office time-stamped every envelope. The physical evidence alone would be indisputable. Next, I scheduled a formal meeting with Ethan, this time in my kitchen with Clara as a neutral witness. I printed all bank statements, investment summaries, and email threads, organizing them by date and category. Each page told a story. A small withdrawal here, an impulsive purchase there, and recurring patterns of overreach. I also included a copy of the HOA warning and property tax notices to show the real-world consequences of delayed payments. I rehearsed my language carefully. Calm, factual, neutral, no snide remarks, no moralizing. This wasn't about shaming. It was about accountability. When Ethan arrived, he carried the usual smug grin. I placed a binder in front of him. Ethan, these are the facts. The account is legally mine. Any unauthorized access moving forward will be considered misuse, and there are lawful ways to address it. He scoffed, waving a hand. Dad, this is ridiculous. I just wanted to use the money responsibly. I didn't flinch. I opened the binder to the first page, a record of his unreported withdrawals, totaling $12 for 50 over 3 months. Responsible. You've covered debts you didn't mention, indulged in unplanned trips, and delayed critical payments. You see the problem. Each section of the binder was a step in the chain. Receipts, bank notifications, HOA notices, and tax deadlines. Clara observed quietly, occasionally making notes. I made sure each page referenced prior communication, so if Ethan tried to dispute later, the evidence trail would be complete. After reviewing the binder, I delivered the next part of the plan, filing for formal legal acknowledgement if the boundaries weren't respected. I had researched small claims procedures and property records extensively. The paperwork was ready. If Ethan tried to withdraw funds without consent again, I could file immediately, supported by certified evidence and witness testimony. Then came the critical leverage, the bank. I scheduled an appointment with the branch manager to confirm account ownership officially. They verified in writing that the assets were in my name and agreed to flag any unauthorized withdrawals. Every future transaction would now require my consent. I also addressed timing with the property tax and HOA issues. Payments were submitted promptly, ensuring no further violations occurred. The careful sequencing of these actions reinforced the seriousness of accountability. Each step showed Ethan the direct consequences of financial mismanagement without breaking any laws. By midweek, the plan was fully operational. Certified notice delivered, meeting completed, witness documentation logged, bank confirmation secured, and property obligations met. Each component created a protective net, ensuring that no unilateral action by Ethan could circumvent lawful boundaries. I leaned back in my chair that Friday evening, Rusty snoring softly. For the first time, I felt a sense of controlled calm. I had anticipated every possible loophole and had systematically closed them, all without raising my voice or breaking the law. The plan was precise, deliberate, and ethical, proof that foresight and documentation are far more powerful than confrontation alone. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. For a brief moment, I allowed myself a sigh of relief. Ethan had sat through the meeting, brows furrowed but quiet, and hadn't tried any withdrawals since the certified notice. The bank confirmation was on file. Deadlines had been met, and the HOA had closed the violation case. It felt like victory, measured, legal, undeniable. Rusty even wagged his tail more energetically that evening, as if sensing the tension had eased. I could almost imagine life returning to normal. I told myself, this is it. The lesson is clear. Boundaries enforced, accountability taught. Then came the backfire. Ethan, in a move that surprised even me, began subtly undermining the progress. He started sending frantic, indirect messages to friends and family, claiming I was being controlling or unfair. Some neighbors, unaware of the full story, sent me awkward messages asking if everything was all right. Social perception, a factor I hadn't fully accounted for, began to pressure me. Next, the small technicalities arose. One of the receipts in my binder was flagged by Ethan's lawyer as unauthorized evidence, and suddenly a minor detail required an extra notarization. That delay risked slowing the official record of account ownership. I spent an entire afternoon at the bank in the notary office, revalidating signatures and reprinting documents. Each small snag made me question if I had underestimated the effort this legal route would demand. Even my ally Clara faced constraints. She was called away unexpectedly, leaving me temporarily without a witness for a few pending filings. I had to scramble, coordinating with another neighbor willing to step in. These logistical hiccups, though minor in isolation, created a domino effect, adding stress and reminding me that even the most carefully laid plans can encounter friction. Ethan himself seemed emboldened. He tried to negotiate small transfers from the account, framing them as urgent expenses. I calmly reminded him that every transaction required my consent, but the repeated testing of boundaries began to feel exhausting. The emotional low point was clear. Victory wasn't complete. Enforcement was one thing. Perception and persistence were another. Then came the mini-public drama. Ethan posted on social media about financial stress, hinting at family disputes. Friends reached out, unsure what to believe. For a moment, I felt a pang of regret. Was my approach too harsh? Had I misjudged the balance between accountability and family loyalty? It was during this low point that a clue surfaced, a minor email buried in my inbox from months ago, misfiled under personal. One line caught my eye. Ethan had expressed genuine concern about upcoming bills, asking if I could advance funds to prevent late fees. It reframed his actions not as purely selfish, but as desperate attempts to manage his obligations. Until one line in an old message changed everything. That line was the key to understanding his true motive. This wasn't rebellion or arrogance. It was miscommunication and unaddressed financial pressure. The backfire, it seemed, wasn't malicious. It was a symptom of the problem I hadn't fully diagnosed. I realized that my plan, while lawful and structured, needed a final refinement. The documents, certified notices, and bank confirmations were necessary, but without a clear communication of intent, empathy aligned with boundaries, the lesson might still be lost. The next phase had to be precise, direct, and unmistakable. It started with a forgotten folder tucked under a stack of old bank statements. I was reviewing documents at my kitchen table, Rusty snuffling nearby, when I found it. A collection of emails, receipts, and text screenshots that I had archived months earlier. Flipping through, one email jumped out. It was from Ethan to a friend, detailing his mounting personal debts and explaining that he'd been hesitant to ask me for help. Reading it, a shock of clarity hit me. Ethan's demands weren't rooted in entitlement alone. They were tied to stress I hadn't fully understood. He'd been juggling client projects, living expenses, and student loans, all while trying to maintain appearances. The lavish trips, the gear, even some of the seemingly unnecessary purchases were attempts to keep his business afloat and protect his professional image. I had misread his motives, seeing only the outward signs of carelessness. The email referenced a forgotten invoice for a photography client, a project he had been paid for but hadn't yet deposited into his account. The timing lined up perfectly with the withdrawals I had flagged. Suddenly, everything clicked. The missing $5,000, the Amazon equipment, even the catered workshop, it wasn't indulgence. It was investment mismanaged under pressure, compounded by fear of asking for help. It was the perfect example of a Chekhov's gun I had unknowingly planted in my own story. The misfiled forms, receipts, and bank alerts all now fit together. Each had been a piece of evidence, not just of misuse, but of a misunderstood attempt at responsibility. My legal and ethical strategy hadn't been wrong. It had been necessary, but my perception of Ethan's intent had been incomplete. I also revisited the HOA notices and property tax deadlines. They weren't just bureaucratic annoyances. They were external pressures that had amplified his stress. In hindsight, the backfire of social pressure and boundary testing wasn't rebellion. It was anxiety manifesting. Understanding that subtle distinction shifted my entire perspective. This revelation changed my approach for the final phase. I realized that enforcing lawful boundaries wasn't enough. I also had to communicate the reasoning behind them. I needed to show Ethan that the account restrictions weren't punitive. They were protective. Clear communication would prevent further misunderstandings while keeping the legal leverage intact. By midday, I had drafted a concise, neutral letter. It acknowledged the email evidence, highlighted the stakes, and reinforced the certified notice's terms. I carefully worded it to blend empathy with accountability. The goal was clarity, not confrontation. I included a step-by-step outline of how future expenses should be handled, complete with timelines, documentation, and required consents. Every potential loophole was addressed. I set up another brief meeting. Ethan arrived, looking apprehensive. I placed the email printouts and documentation on the table, carefully avoiding any accusatory tone. Ethan, I see now that some of these withdrawals were tied to real obligations, I said. I also need to protect these accounts and the associated properties. Here's how we'll handle it moving forward. He paused, scanning the documents. The surprise on his face told me he hadn't realized I had found his email. He swallowed and nodded slowly. The gravity of the situation and the fairness of my approach had hit him. It was a human moment. He wasn't defiant. He was seeing the consequence of miscommunication and the value of structured boundaries. Now I knew exactly where to stand. I had the lawful leverage, the evidence trail, and the witnesses. More importantly, I understood the motives driving the behavior. Enforcement wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about guidance, responsibility, and shared clarity. Every Chekhov's gun I had planted, the receipts, notices, and emails, had paid off, culminating in a clear and actionable plan. With this reveal, the path to resolution and clean, lawful revenge was no longer just theoretical. The final act wasn't about asserting power. It was about closing the loop ethically, ensuring accountability, and allowing Ethan to step into responsibility with eyes wide open. With clarity in hand, I moved into the final phase of my plan, lawful, structured, and fully documented. Everything I had built, the certified notices, witness confirmations, bank statements, HOA records, and the major reveal of Ethan's email, formed a foundation too solid to be disputed. Now, it was time to enforce the consequences and close the loop. The first step was formal notification. I drafted a concise letter, delivered via certified mail and email, stating explicitly, effective immediately, no withdrawals from this account are authorized without written consent from the account holder. Unauthorized transactions will be addressed through lawful channels. I included copies of the bank confirmation and referenced all prior documentation. The language was firm but factual. No anger, no moral judgment, just law and accountability. Then came the personal meeting. Ethan arrived, eyes shifting between nerves and defensiveness. Clara sat beside me, pen poised to notarize his acknowledgement of the terms. I opened the binder once again, presenting each document as calmly as I could. These actions aren't punitive, I said. They're protective. They exist to prevent future financial missteps and preserve your credit and reputation. As I walked him through the evidence, I could see the adrenaline drain from my own chest. The tension that had built over weeks, the misfiled forms, the HOA notices, the back-and-forth emails, began to dissolve. Ethan's face shifted from defiance to comprehension. He realized that his attempts to manipulate or bypass boundaries were now fully transparent and documented. The moment of catharsis came when he signed the acknowledgement. Clara notarized the signature. The act itself was simple, a pen on paper, but it carried enormous weight. Legally, the account was under my full oversight. Psychologically, Ethan had been confronted with the consequences of his choices and the necessity of accountability. Next, I implemented the bank's preventative measures. Each future transaction required dual authorization. Any attempt at unauthorized withdrawal would trigger immediate notification to both the bank and me. The financial control, once disputed, was now safeguarded with undeniable authority. It wasn't revenge in the sense of punishment. It was revenge as restoration, a restoration of order and responsibility. I also addressed the HOA and tax matters. Payments were confirmed, receipts filed, and deadlines noted. Every external obligation tied to the account was now shielded against accidental mismanagement. Even minor delays, once a source of anxiety, were eliminated. Emotionally, the effect was immediate. The weeks of frustration, worry, and tension melted into a steady calm. I could sit in my kitchen, sipping coffee, watching Rusty nap at a sunbeam, and feel a sense of completion. The plan had been executed flawlessly within legal boundaries, and the lesson had been conveyed without resorting to anger or cruelty. Ethan, surprisingly, expressed gratitude, a hesitant but genuine acknowledgement of the clarity and structure I had provided. "I get it now," he said. "I see why you had to do all this. It makes sense." Hearing those words, I realized that the legal leverage had done more than protect assets. It had opened the door for him to take responsibility voluntarily, a step toward genuine growth. I felt a rush of adrenaline followed by a profound calm. Every certified letter, every notarized signature, every carefully documented step had led to this moment. The ethical revenge, the lawful assertion of boundaries, had worked better than any impulsive reaction could have. I didn't need to humiliate or punish. The structure of law and documentation did the work for me. Then came the ripple effect. Friends and family, previously caught in the rumors and confusion, began to see the situation clearly. Calls of concern turned into messages of acknowledgement. Even a few neighbors who had quietly questioned my approach expressed support once they understood the meticulous fairness of the actions. The social pressure, once a backfire, now reinforced the legitimacy of my approach. For Ethan, the lesson wasn't just financial. It was practical and personal. He learned that transparency, timely communication, and adherence to lawful boundaries are non-negotiable. His future attempts to manage the account would now be framed by these principles, reducing the risk of further missteps. In the end, the revenge was clean because it was lawful, transparent, and proportionate. The catharsis wasn't in seeing him fail or feel shame. It was in witnessing structure and accountability restore balance. I had used the tools of law, documentation, and measured communication to turn entitlement into responsibility, confusion into clarity, and chaos into order. And as I closed the binder, the sun casting warm afternoon light across the table, I realized something crucial. The plan hadn't just been about the money. It had been about boundaries, foresight, and the courage to enforce them ethically. Every step, every certified notice, every notarized signature, every bank verification had been a lesson in responsible action. Then came the calls. The bank confirmed all measures were in place. Clara filed her witness notarization, and even Ethan called to clarify a minor procedural question. The tension was gone. I leaned back, Rusty curled at my feet, and felt a rare, quiet satisfaction. The lawful, ethical, and fully documented plan had reached its final resolution. Victory wasn't flashy. There was no gloating, no vindictive celebration. The satisfaction was internal, a sense of order restored, fairness achieved, and lessons imparted without breaking the law. The days after the execution of the plan were remarkably calm. The certified notices, notarized acknowledgement, and bank safeguards had all taken effect. Ethan didn't attempt any unauthorized withdrawals. The tension that had plagued our home for weeks, the arguments, the subtle manipulations, the social whispers, was replaced with quiet order. Friends and family reached out, expressing curiosity at first, then respect for the way the situation had been handled. "You were firm but fair," one cousin said. "I can see how you protected yourself and taught him responsibility." Even neighbors who had been uncertain about the dispute now offered small nods of acknowledgement when we crossed paths. The social ripple had transformed from backfire to quiet validation. Ethan adapted to the boundaries surprisingly quickly. He began sending notifications before any planned transaction, asking for guidance when necessary, and showing a level of fiscal awareness he hadn't displayed before. Watching him navigate responsibility was unexpectedly gratifying, proof that lawful enforcement and clear communication could foster growth rather than resentment. On the practical side, the HOA closed the balcony issue permanently once the repairs were verified. Property taxes were submitted on schedule, and bank confirmations solidified my legal claim. No further administrative issues arose. The documents I had painstakingly gathered, receipts, emails, notices, were filed neatly, forming a complete record should anything arise in the future. Yet even with everything seemingly resolved, a subtle ripple reminded me that accountability is ongoing. Ethan tested small boundaries occasionally, asking about minor fees, or pushing slightly for exceptions, but each time, the established rules held. I could respond calmly, citing documentation and prior agreements. The plan had created a self-sustaining structure that required minimal enforcement, yet maximized clarity. And just when I thought it was settled, a small email arrived from Ethan's accountant. It confirmed that one of the earlier withdrawals I had flagged had been misapplied due to a bank coding error. While it complicated the ledger slightly, it also reinforced the importance of precise documentation. Every verified transaction, every notarized acknowledgement, and every certified notice meant we could quickly identify and correct errors without conflict. The fallout was measured and fair. No one had been humiliated, no laws were broken, and the lesson had been delivered without drama or malice. Responsibility had replaced entitlement, structure replaced chaos, and clarity replaced misunderstanding. Just when I thought the storm had fully passed, a subtle twist emerged. One Friday afternoon, Clara called me at work, her voice slightly hesitant. "I need to tell you something about the notarizations." It turned out that the first notarization had a small clerical oversight. The notary had misdated one page by a single day, a detail that could have allowed Ethan to question the timeline. Initially, I felt a flicker of panic. Weeks of preparation, countless hours of documentation, and one tiny oversight could have undermined everything. But then came the second twist, more revealing. Clara admitted she had intentionally delayed notifying me. Why? She wanted to see if Ethan would respect the boundaries, even when the paperwork wasn't perfect. It was a subtle, human test, a quiet way of gauging whether the legal framework was effective or if enforcement relied purely on fear of paperwork. The irony wasn't lost on me. While I had meticulously structured every document, certified every notice, and secured witness testimony, the real measure of success wasn't legal perfection. It was behavioral change. The twist revealed that Ethan's accountability wasn't dependent solely on enforcement. It was embedded in the pattern of transparency, clarity, and consistency we had established. Reflecting on it, I realized how much I had grown in the process. My misbelief that keeping the peace and letting things slide was safer than enforcing boundaries was shattered. True responsibility isn't taught through fear or anger. It's cultivated through consistent, fair, and lawful expectations, paired with transparency. The final twist reinforced this lesson. Ethan had internalized the rules. Even after learning about the clerical misstep, he continued to follow protocol, notifying me of planned withdrawals, respecting timelines, and communicating clearly. Clara's test had demonstrated that the plan's impact was not fragile. It had created lasting behavioral change. I also noticed a personal shift. I no longer felt the need to micromanage or anticipate every misstep. The structure was self-sustaining. Accountability had become habitual, and my role was now more of a guide than an enforcer. The double twist, first the clerical oversight, then the hidden test, confirmed that the ethical, lawful approach had achieved what anger or unilateral control never could. By the end of that week, I felt a quiet sense of completion. The account was secure, the boundaries respected, and Ethan had grown in ways I hadn't anticipated. The twists weren't setbacks. They were reminders that human behavior, when guided by fairness and law, can respond predictably to ethical constraints. What I learned wasn't about Ethan or the bank or even the HOA. It was about me, about the courage to enforce boundaries legally, about patience, and about trusting that fairness, combined with structure, produces real, lasting change. Sitting back in my kitchen, Rusty curled at my feet, I reflected on the journey. My misbelief that keeping the peace was safer than setting boundaries had been completely overturned. I had learned that true protection and responsibility don't come from avoiding conflict. They come from structured, lawful enforcement and clear communication. One lesson was about boundaries. They aren't walls meant to punish or control. They're markers of accountability, fairness, and respect. Ethan's initial defiance and testing of limits showed me that unless expectations are explicit and supported by lawful frameworks, misunderstandings and missteps are inevitable. Certified notices, notarized acknowledgments, and bank confirmations weren't about revenge. They were about creating a safe, enforceable structure for everyone involved. Another takeaway was about consent and transparency. Each action had to be visible, documented, and ethical. The midpoints of the story, the discovery of the email, the formal meeting with witnesses, and the notarized signatures, demonstrated that lawful measures carry weight precisely because they are fair, transparent, and accountable. It wasn't enough to act. The action had to be communicated clearly and consistently. Finally, I realized the value of foresight and planning. I had prepared for complications, setbacks, and even backfires. When Clara quietly tested the plan with the clerical oversight, I saw firsthand that ethical, premeditated steps were more powerful than emotional reactions. Planning, structure, and patience, not anger or impulsiveness, had turned potential chaos into clarity. In short, the story wasn't just about protecting money or property. It was about personal growth, ethical assertiveness, and teaching responsibility through lawful measures. By shifting focus from control to accountability, I created outcomes that were fair, transparent, and lasting. Here's the picture I want you to keep. A situation that started with tension, defiance, and miscommunication transformed into one of clarity, growth, and ethical enforcement. The lesson isn't about victory over someone else. It's about mastering the tools of fairness and law to guide behavior responsibly. The kitchen was quiet that evening, sunlight spilling across the counter and lighting up the binder I had used to document every step of the process. Rusty stretched and yawned, resting his head on the rug. The space felt different now, not tense, not fraught with unspoken conflict, but calm, ordered, and intentional. I glanced at the stack of certified notices, the notarized acknowledgement, and the neatly filed receipts. Each item told a story of preparation, patience, and lawful action. More than that, they represented lessons learned, boundaries clearly enforced, communication maintained, and accountability cultivated. It was a visual echo of everything that had transpired, proof that structure and fairness can resolve even the most personal disputes. Ethan walked in, quietly placing a folder on the counter. "Thanks for taking the time to explain everything," he said, almost shyly. There was no defiance in his tone, no lingering tension. He understood the rules, the boundaries, and the reasoning behind them. Watching him step into responsibility willingly was a subtle but profound victory. I poured myself a cup of coffee, feeling a rare sense of satisfaction. The money was protected, the account secured, and the lesson delivered, not through anger, but through law, structure, and ethical planning. What had started as a confrontation had become a testament to patience, documentation, and accountability. Same kitchen, different me. If this hit home, subscribe and tell me your state in the comments. Your story might be next. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the countertops. Rusty lifted his head, tail wagging softly, and I realized that the real triumph wasn't the money, the documents, or even the legal leverage. It was the calm certainty that comes from taking the right steps in the right way. Everything was finally in its place. Lessons taught, boundaries respected, and responsibility earned. And for the first time in weeks, I could just sit back, sip my coffee, and know that justice, ethical, lawful, and fair, had been served.